as a founder and as a co-founder, how willing and how dedicated people are to a project that has a vision and it has a purpose that is, let's call it societally transformative. And it has a purpose that is beyond the narrow focus of a cash flow solution, right?
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Chad Lynch, co-founder at Loreum. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast where we do snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Chad from Loreum. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm here today with Chad Lynch, co-founder at Loreum. Chad, how's it going today?
It's going very well. Thank you, Tanner.
Yeah. Thanks so much for taking the time to hop on the show. I think we have a ton to talk about, so I'm excited to learn more about what you guys are doing at Loreum. Here to start, maybe could you just tell us a little bit about really just your story and kind of what brought you to building what you're building at Loreum?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Chad, originally from Canada, been traveling around the world, went to Asia, South Korea in about the year 2000 and spent a lot of time there, got into Bitcoin and a lot of centralized exchange trading pretty early in around 2013 and as a software developer. So I built a lot of program trading on the back end, worked on a few exchanges there for the years, and then got into options exchanges and other different programmatic and algorithmic trading opportunities there. And then that sort of took me into, after Mt. Gox, into a security phase. So I worked in cybersecurity as an engineer, doing incident response, and created a pretty early team out of Singapore with Rangi Cybersecurity, a team that focused specifically on crypto security. And in those days, in about 2017, a lot of that was versioning ICO, Ethereum smart contract auditing of consulting work, and then also a lot of back-end operational wallet security. So the crypto team that we built there very well during that period, and we built some nice internal processes with relation to custodial operations out of Singapore. So from there, I took a little bit of time and then jumped into another startup. And the startup was called Maple Finance. And Maple is, it's an under collateralized lending protocol built on Ethereum that focuses more on the institutional side of the business. So I was the first engineer there and helped to architect and build out the solutions, the version 1 of the protocol. My role was on the off-chain side. So I did a lot of the application, the product, and the data indexing, and a lot of the stuff that was more product related. So we did very well there. Did a great LBP, launched the Maple token, had a lot of success there. As the cycle sort of topped in 2022 around May, I ended up leaving and taking some time. And after a few months, I started working on Loreum. And so Loreum is a new project. And a lot of the learnings I've taken both from cybersecurity in terms of founder risk and operational security with relation to crypto assets, combined with my learning from DAOs and Maple's attempt at building out a decentralized organization. I've steered my focus more towards DAO tooling and DAO governance contracts within the Ethereum ecosystem. So that's what Loreum's working on now. And I guess that brings me up to the present with you, Tanner.
Yeah, perfect. So, before we talk kind of more in depth about what Loreum's building, let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the backdrop or the situation first, where I'd love to maybe just hear you situate us kind of within the context that precipitates Loreum. Like, what were some of those insights from Maple and elsewhere, just as kind of a veteran of the space, that made Loreum worthwhile to invest time into?
Well, I think there's a core tenet in Loreum that I think I've learned from Maple. And this is also within the context of my larger philosophical worldview. But I'll start with the Loreum specific tenet. And that is that DAOs are incredibly centralized. They seek to be decentralized, and they want to be within the ethos of the crypto space to be decentralized and community focused and robust and secure by being uncentralized and decentralized. But the reality is that most protocol projects, most DAOs, I would argue even more centralized than your average venture startup as they are incorporated legally. So that was the big learning that I sort of took out of my experience working with Maple, and then also a lot of the partners and vendors we were working with, is that there's an incredible amount of centralization, and it's not that projects and teams want to be centralized. I think it's just the nature of the tooling and the nature of the maturity of cat herding and managing disparate online global communities. There just wasn't the right mix of tooling and operational experience to leverage the decentralized nature of the technology conveniently. And so that's the core learning that I took from Maple. The other learning is that ERC20 tokens are incredibly powerful as a governance token. And without saying equity, it's more like this new type of governance functionality. And I find a lot of DAOs would focus on a business problem, and certainly in the context of Maple, and neglect the governance tooling aspect of the protocol. And a lot of that would get neglected. It would be pushed into the backlog. And so what we had was a lot of governance tokens with incredible capital efficiency, raising a lot of capital, but not facilitating the promise with regards to representing, interests from the community. And so that's one thing I discovered from my experience with Maple. And the guys at Maple are incredible people. Sid and Joe built an incredible protocol, but as everybody knows, when you're building a startup, you're moving fast, and you have to tackle the fastest route to cash flow, essentially. And for most protocols, governance and on-chain decision making and community engagement, those things typically are a nice to have during a fast build cycle. So Loreum is a set of tooling in a contract protocol that really takes that governance token, that ERC20 token, and just injects an incredible amount of utility into essentially what I think is a spot market of governance. So you want to take that ability to make good decisions, you want to get community engagement, and you want to have direct representation from a token utility perspective. And you just want to wrap that up into a framework that is kind of a one-click solution.
Got it. That's super interesting. So, what are some of the unlocks you hope to accomplish with this tooling where, if things continue to progress? What's different in the world if there is this better coordination, especially for decentralized communities or networks? Is it kind of about fulfilling some of the early promise that maybe is unfulfilled as of yet, at least in most projects from a decentralization standpoint?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just double back on my larger philosophical outlook of the space.
Yeah.
And one of the issues that I think informed my desire and passion for this problem is the relative inefficiency of the nation state incorporated entity. And the global nature of our workforce is just not adequately utilized from a corporate instantiation perspective. And we find a lot of DAOs are feeling around into this, gray legal space for foundations in the Caymans, or specially structured operating agreements out of Wyoming, and all of these different kind of very difficult incorporated entities to facilitate this transnational problem. And another way to look at it is, if you see an incredible amount of talent in Pakistan or Kazakhstan or a lot of very smart countries, it's very difficult to deploy capital to those incorporated entities that are resident in those jurisdictions or in those nation states because of a lack of trust or of ignorance. So I think that a really nice, clean governance protocol deployed onto Ethereum is actually, it can leverage an incredible efficiency for capital formation that's transnational, and that can allow capital to deploy into different regions, into different problem sets more efficiently. So that's the kind of backdrop of what Loreum is. And so, yeah, it's definitely a decentralization technology that seeks to leverage, on one side, capital formation, but then on the other side, an incredible labor market that is transnational. And how do you bring those together into a very efficient framework?
Yeah, I love it. So as we're talking about this subject, I'm curious what you think are some of the biggest things that people miss when thinking about whether it's governance problems or maybe just coordination more generally, where it might be even actually like a twist on kind of that classic Teal question of like, what's one thing you believe that others generally don't, but maybe almost reverse, where like, what do you see as important when thinking about coordination or governance that others are missing?
Yeah. I think the big thing that we take from the startup world when we're forming a company is we take the notion that, the desire is to acquire and to hold a large piece of the equity pie as founders. But in fact, the reverse is sometimes true, in that it's better to actually have a smaller piece of a much larger pie. So So the notion that we need to covet, pearl clutch our equity and keep it close to our vest and have these entities that are centralized from a founder risk perspective, I think that is not as beneficial as reaching a kind of, a facilitating coordination through being more equitable with the distribution of equity and ownership. Now, the problem is, how do you efficiently and effectively allocate, sweat equity and ownership into a disparate global online anonymous community? That's a very challenging thing. And the product or the contract that we are building, the Loreum Chamber, it creates a leaderboard of good decision making within on-chain proposal history. So it allows you to very efficiently allocate equity to the best decisions that are being made. And I like to call it like a spot market of governance. So it rewards people within your DAO for achieving sound and profitable and beneficial results.
Yeah, I love it. That's fascinating. Since it's my understanding you guys are pretty early in the journey for building Loreum, in light of some of what you were just saying, like what have been some of the early challenges with all of that you've experienced thus far, and how are you and your team solving for them?
So one of the biggest challenges I find with DAOs and online protocols is how to get engagement from your community. How do you replicate the efficiency of a regular startup with the context of a more open, decentralized community? So how do you execute? How do you build efficiently? How do you coordinate? How do you get consensus rapidly? And how do you do that in a way without over centralizing the decision making and the creativity? So I think that's the core problem I think that a lot of DAOs have. And the solution that we're looking at is we just need better Web3, highly scalable execution tooling and productivity tooling. So we like to think of, within the context of Web3, how do we get something like Airtable that is a productivity execution platform? How do we get that from a payment seat licensing perspective? How do we get that into a community that scales to 10,000 seats without breaking the bank? So how do we do those payment models, and how do we get the basic tooling in the Web2 space, and how do we craft that and build that for execution that scales?
Yeah,
Yeah.
super interesting. So along that path, I'm curious what else has stood out as surprising. So, I'm sure things come up that you weren't expecting, or things turned out to be more important that you thought were going to be lesser priorities. I'm curious what those surprises have been so far. Maybe just a couple.
Yeah. The biggest surprise for me is, as a founder and as a co-founder, how willing and how dedicated people are to a project that has a vision and it has a purpose that is, let's call it societally transformative. And it has a purpose that is beyond the narrow focus of, a cash flow solution, right? So within the context of Loreum, being able to go beyond these restrictive nation state isolated corporate entities, how do we move beyond, and how do we evolve the societal primitives that have largely built our Western civilization and now global civilization? What's next? Like, how do we get to the next level in terms of human coordination? So that's the big thing, is how dedicated and how motivated people can be when posing a problem that is, societal.
Yeah, even from the outside, it's definitely one of those things that I can see people really light up and would want to rally behind, because if it's kind of thought about correctly and built out correctly, it can really have some serious implications for not even just the whole space, really just how kind of, I like that language you use of kind of societal transformation. It could be that significant. So I totally get that. On that note, like just excitement, or I guess I'd put it like this, like as you think about what Loreum's building, what gets you most excited about it? I can tell even just from kind of chatting a little bit that, you're really in it, it seems, for the right reasons, and you care you care more about some of these ideas you're talking about than just kind of making a quick buck, right? So curious, like, where does that excitement come from? What are you most excited about as you think about what Loreum's building? Anything around that?
Yeah, so Loreum, like the architecture of our chamber contract, really shines when you look at something like FTX, the collapse of a centralized incorporated entity that has been largely offshored through punitive regulatory action. So when you look into the context, even specifically of how FTX was managed, we had zero transparency. We had no idea about the accounting practices. There was no segregation of risk, or there was commingling of funds. So there were so many issues. The simple nature of transparent data from the blockchain can really alleviate and can both make it more equitable and more socially just in terms of, from the regulator's perspective, from if you're an investor doing due diligence on an entity, with what pains you have to pursue, private entities, like trying to get that picture of the actual health of a cap table on a spreadsheet. So there's so many ways that Loreum can provide a lot of social good, and that's really is what is driving the project. And when we see things like FTX and the way that project, from all perspectives, there's a lot that Loreum can do to remove that type of situation.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit and talk just about kind of the crypto blockchain space more generally, where how do you see your work fitting into broader trends that even on this podcast we've heard a lot about lately? It seems to be kind of just in the air about actually getting to the next inning in terms of actually delivering on some of the promises of the crypto community, where we've seen so much activity, and yet there seems to be this sense that we're not quite where things should be, right? I'm curious how you see Loreum fitting into that conversation.
Yeah, that's a big one. I think one of the biggest drawbacks that we have is the user experience of the wallets themselves. And we have to get over that hurdle. And the Loreum Chamber is itself, it's a multi-signature wallet. So having account abstracted functionality that solve a lot of role-based access controls and it brings a lot of more kind of institutional type of risk management into those transactions and into those asset holdings. That is a big one for me, just having better security from a tooling perspective in the way that wallets function. And then another big one, I think, from the space in general is, I think that we need to get a better, obviously, we're going to have the scalability, we're going to have proto-dank sharding coming down the pipe, and we need to get that nice integration from, that cryptographic circuit across ZK chains, and getting that Ethereum integration from let's call it the cryptographic circuit. We really have to nail that to enable scaling and just make the space a little bit more cross-chain.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so 2 last questions here. First question, what would your advice be for founders building in the Web3 space more generally? If you had to kind of speak to yourself at the very beginning of this journey, what would you want to impart to you?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Yeah, the one thing that I would say is it's probably better to think about what does the space need, and start to think about problems that are very passionate from your own worldview. So and then try to solve those problems without pouring a lot of money and time and effort into starting to write Solidity or doing a lot of heavy expensive engineering work. Start with identifying the problem space that you want to approach, and then begin to ideate, to begin to validate with conversations and talking to people, and really narrow down like what it is that you want to accomplish. And then when you start to build and when you start to develop your solution, you're not doing heavy, expensive pivoting with seed capital, without that risk or without the anxiety to get cash flow positive before you've really identified the solution that you want to build. So that kind of pre-project ideation and validation, I think that is super critical. We just have to get better at that in the space so we're not burning engineering expense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, so Chad, what is your team working on right now, and what's the best way for people to follow along on your journey?
Great. Yeah. So right now we're working on developing the first version of our product, which is the Loreum Chamber. It's a DAO and it's a Web3 community, a governance solution. So we're building that out. And the best way to get a hold of us is you can email me personally, chad@loreum.org, or you can reach out to us on our website, loreum.org, and be happy to talk to anybody, get onto calls, and start to ideate and validate our solution if anybody's interested.
Love it. Chad, thank you so much for the time. This is super interesting, and I'm really excited to watch how things progress over the coming weeks and months. And thank you for the time hopping on the show. So have a great rest of your week here, and take care.
Thank you very much, Tanner.
All right. Bye-bye.